Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. Chapter 18. Mirth and Mourning. The 1st of June arrived at last, and Rosalie Murray was transmuted into Lady Ashby. Most splendidly beautiful she looked in her bridal costume. Upon her return from church, after the ceremony, she came flying into the schoolroom, flushed with excitement, and laughing, half in mirth, and half in reckless desperation, as it seemed to me. "Now, Miss Grey, I am Lady Ashby," she exclaimed. "It's done. My fate is sealed. There's no drawing back now. I'm come to receive your congratulations and bid you good-bye, and then I'm off for Paris, Rome, Naples, Switzerland, London. Oh dear, what a deal I shall see and hear before I come back again! But don't forget me. I shan't forget you, though I've been a naughty girl. Come, why don't you congratulate me?" "I cannot congratulate you," I replied, "till I know whether this change is really for the better. But I sincerely hope it is, and wish you true happiness and the best of blessings." "Well, good-bye. The carriage is waiting, and they're calling me." She gave me a hasty kiss, and was hurrying away, but suddenly returning, embraced me with more affection than I thought her capable of evincing, and departed with tears in her eyes. Poor girl! I really loved her then, and forgave her from my heart all the injury she had done me, and also others. She had not half known it, I was sure, and I prayed God to pardon her too. During the remainder of that day of festal sadness, I was left to my own devices. Being too much unhinged for any steady occupation, I wandered about with a book in my hand for several hours, more thinking than reading, for I had many things to think about. In the evening I made use of my liberty to go and see my old friend Nancy once again, to apologize for my long absence, which must have seemed so neglectful and unkind, by telling her how busy I had been, and to talk or read or work for her, whichever might be most acceptable, and also, of course, to tell her the news of this important day, and perhaps to obtain a little information from her in return, respecting Mr. Weston's expected departure. But of this she seemed to know nothing, and I hoped, as she did, that it was a false report. She was very glad to see me, but happily her eyes were now so nearly well that she was almost independent of my services. She was deeply interested in the wedding, but while I amused her with the details of the festive day, the splendors of the bridal party, and the bride herself, she often sighed and shook her head, and wished good might come of it. She seemed, like me, to regard it rather as a theme for sorrow than rejoicing. I sat a long time talking to her about that and other things, but no one came. Shall I confess that I sometimes looked towards the door with a half-expectant wish to see it open and give entrance to Mr. Weston, as had happened once before, and that, returning through the lanes and fields, I often paused to look round me, and walked more slowly than was at all necessary, for though a fine evening, it was not a hot one, and finally felt a sense of emptiness and disappointment at having reached the house without meeting or even catching a distant glimpse of anyone except a few labourers returning from their work. Sunday, however, was approaching. I should see him then, for now that Miss Murray was gone, I could have my old corner again. I should see him, and by look, speech, and manner, I might judge whether the circumstances of her marriage had very much afflicted him. Happily I could perceive no shadow of a difference. He wore the same aspect as he had worn 2 months ago, voice, look, manner, all alike unchanged. There was the same keen-sighted, unclouded truthfulness in his discourse, the same forcible clearness in his style, the same earnest simplicity in all he said and did, that made itself not marked by the eye and ear, but felt upon the heart of his audience. I walked home with Miss Matilda, but he did not join us. Matilda was now sadly at a loss for amusement, and woefully in want of a companion. Her brothers at school, her sister married and gone, she too young to be admitted into society, for which, from Rosalie's example, she was in some degree beginning to acquire a taste at least for the company of certain classes of gentlemen. At this dull time of year, no hunting going on, no shooting even, for though she might not join in that, it was something to see her father or the gamekeeper go out with the dogs, and to talk with them upon their return about the different birds they had bagged. Now also she was denied the solace which the companionship of the coachman, grooms, horses, greyhounds, and pointers might have afforded; for her mother having, notwithstanding the disadvantages of a country life, so satisfactorily disposed of her elder daughter, the pride of her heart had begun seriously to turn her attention to the younger, and, being truly alarmed at the roughness of her manners, and thinking it high time to work a reform, had been roused at length to exert her authority, and prohibited entirely the yards, stables, kennels, and coach-house. Of course she was not implicitly obeyed, but indulgent as she had hitherto been, when once her spirit was roused, her temper was not so gentle as she required that of her governess to be, and her will was not to be thwarted with impunity. After many a scene of contention between mother and daughter, many a violent outbreak, which I was ashamed to witness, in which the father's authority was often called in to confirm with oaths and threats the mother's slighted prohibitions, for even he could see that Tilly, though she would have made a fine lad, was not quite what a young lady ought to be. Matilda at length found that her easiest plan was to keep clear of the forbidden regions, unless she could now and then steal a visit without her watchful mother's knowledge. Amid all this, let it not be imagined that I escaped without many a reprimand and many an implied reproach, that lost none of its sting from being openly worded, but rather wounded the more deeply, because, from that very reason, it seemed to preclude self-defence. Frequently I was told to amuse Miss Matilda with other things, and to remind her of her mother's precepts and prohibitions. I did so to the best of my power, but she would not be amused against her will, and could not against her taste; and though I went beyond mere reminding, such gentle remonstrance as I could use were utterly ineffectual. "Dear Miss Grey, it is the strangest thing. I suppose you can't help it, if it's not in your nature, but I wonder you can't win the confidence of that girl, and make your society at least as agreeable to hers as that of Robert or Joseph." "They can talk the best about things in which she is most interested," I replied. "Well, that is a strange confession, however, to come from her governess. Who is to form a young lady's taste, I wonder, if the governess doesn't do it?" I have known governesses who have so completely identified themselves with the reputation of their young ladies for elegance and propriety in mind and manners, that they would blush to speak a word against them, and to hear the slightest blame imputed to their pupils was worse than to be censured in their own persons, and I really think it very natural for my part. "Do you, ma'am?" "Yes, of course. The young lady's proficiency in elegance is of more consequence to the governess than her own, as well as to the world. If she wishes to prosper in her vocation, she must devote all her energies to her business. All her ideas and all her ambition will tend to the accomplishment of that one object. When we wish to decide upon the merits of a governess, we naturally look at the young ladies she professes to have educated, and judge accordingly. The judicious governess knows this. She knows that while she lives in obscurity herself, her pupils' virtues and defects will be open to every eye, and that, unless she loses sight of herself in their cultivation, she need not hope for success. You see, Miss Grey, it is just the same as any other trade or profession. They that wish to prosper must devote themselves body and soul to their calling, and if they begin to yield in indolence or self-indulgence, they are speedily distanced by wiser competitors. There is little choice between a person that ruins her pupil by neglect, and one that corrupts them by her example. You will excuse my dropping these little hints. You know it is all for your own good. Many ladies would speak to you much more strongly, and many would not trouble themselves to speak to you at all, but quietly look out for a substitute. That, of course, would be the easiest plan. But I know the advantages of a place like this to a person in your situation, and I have no desire to part with you, as I am sure you would do very well if you would only think of these things and try to exert yourself a little more. Then I am convinced you would soon acquire that delicate tact which alone is wanting to give you a proper influence over the mind of your pupil."